Hi, I'm Justin.
And I'm Kelsey, and the experiment that we did was over IR spectroscopy. IR spectroscopy is a method used to determine different functional groups within a compound. This is not to be confused with mass spec, which is used to determine the M to Z ratio or the molecular ion for a compound. This is also the molecular weight of the compound. The purpose of this experiment was to classify two unknown liquids and one unknown solid by using IR spectroscopy methods.
Okay, so the procedure that was used in this experiment dealt with determining the chemical formula for three unknowns, which were two liquids and one solid, by use of the IR spectrum that was generated through the spectrophotometer. The first IR spectrum was formed by placing a few drops of the unknown liquid onto an NaCl salt plate and placing the two sides of the salt plate around the liquid. The plate was then placed into the spectrophotometer to convert absorbance to percent transmittance, which enabled us to see the different peaks that were formed by the compound. For the next two unknowns, the solid and the liquid, they were not placed into an NaCl salt plate, but instead placed directly onto the stage of the spectrophotometer. They were also analyzed for functional groups to determine the structures of the unknowns by locating the different peaks that formed. These were also compared to the actual IR spectra for each of the unknowns to find the best match based off the functional groups.
The results for the three unknowns, including the wave number and the functional group chosen, can be seen on the following three tables. The first unknown was labeled as liquid number 10. This was the one that was placed into an NaCl salt plate to be analyzed. There were three peaks found, one at 1,700, another at 2,863, and a third at 2,958. The first peak at 1,700 would indicate a C double bond to an O. The next peak at 2,863 would indicate a C sp3 bond to an H, and the third peak at 2,958 would then indicate a C sp2 bond to an H. After taking the functional groups into consideration, the identity of the unknown is thought to be cyclohexanone.
The second unknown that was studied was the liquid 3. The liquid 3 IR spectra was harder to observe because of the fact that only one major peak was seen. This peak was observed at 3,315, which indicates an OH bond. Although the bond that was observed in the spectrum was not as broad or as strong as typically seen in an OH bond, it was still present. Also, after carefully considering and observing the spectra, smaller peaks could be seen at around the 2,873 mark, which indicate a C-sp2 hybridized H bond. Because of the functional groups that were seen in the spectrum, the unknown is thought to be benzyl alcohol. This validates the thought that there were an OH bond present along with a double bond, which is shown by the C-sp2 hybridized H bond.
The third unknown used was solid, and it was labeled as solid number 6. This unknown was the hardest to see the functional groups in, but it still contained three main peaks that were observed at 1,700, 2,359, and within a range of 3,560 and 3,750. The peak at 1,700 was an indicator for a C double bond to an O. The peak at 2,359 would typically indicate a triple bond between a C and an N, or between a C and a C. But none of the given unknowns contained an alkyne, so then it was assumed that instead it was a C sp3 bond to an H. This was out of place for this type of bond, which shows some degree of error. The range of peaks between 3,650 and 3,750 are in the range for an N to H bond. This also could have been due to the error or extra noise in the IR spectrum trial. Based on the functional groups and along with the viewing of the typical IR spectrum, it is hypothesized that the unknown is benzanilide.
The spectrum observed is shown for the first unknown, liquid 10. It can be compared to the typical spectrum for cyclohexanone as follows.
This is the IR spectrum that was observed for liquid 3. After comparing it to the typical spectrum as follows, it is thought to be benzyl alcohol. This is the IR spectrum that was observed for solid 6. After comparing it to the typical spectrum as follows, the unknown is thought to be benzanilide.
In conclusion, the main objective of this experiment was to determine the structure and identity of 3 unknowns through IR spectroscopy data. For the most part, the results were successful, but for other unknowns, the data was inconclusive. It was seen that the most accurate IR data came from using the salt plate. For 2 of the IR spectra, the peaks were harder to classify. This could be due to errors within the trials. These errors could be due to not using a salt plate, causing extra noise within the spectra. Also, contaminants in the air or on the stage could contribute to misreadings in the peaks. Overall, because it was possible to determine the identity for the 3 unknowns, success was achieved in the experiment.